Newsmaker Saturday starts now.
Thanks for joining us on Newsmaker Saturday. We're going to talk about the issue that so many people are talking about, a new Gallup poll out showing that issues about immigration are at the very top of mind for American voters right now, at 23%, thinking that that is the biggest issue facing us. Pima County Sheriff Mark Napier is my guest on Newsmaker Saturday, elected in 2016, an Army veteran, 28 years of law enforcement experience, and he is the sheriff of Pima County, which shares a 125-mile border with Mexico. Sheriff, great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
And congratulations. I worked many years with Clarence Dupnick. He was a sheriff there. He's a legend. And you took over when he retired.
Yeah, there was an interim sheriff for a couple of years between Clarence and myself. And I took over. I actually took office January 1st, 2017.
You were with Tucson Police Department when I was down there working. I worked in Tucson for 8 years, 85 to 93. And this border issue, it's been going on as long as I can remember. But it was Mexican nationals coming across. Now we're seeing this influx of Central Americans and families.
It's very much changed. I started with Tucson Police in 1987. And then it was mostly males from Mexico, single, traveling in small groups or individuals coming across the border. And now it's more than 60% are OTMs, other than Mexicans, and family units and unaccompanied minors. So the scope of this has changed dramatically in the last 30 years.
Is that because Mexico's economy has improved? So the numbers of Mexican nationals coming across to work here has dropped?
I think it's that, and also the very aggravated conditions in Central America. If you're in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras right now, the plight of those people in that country are very strained. Economically, from a safety standpoint, they're facing many perils that are very, very significant. I think that's causing a lot of the mass migration that we're seeing.
How much of this ends up in Tucson proper? I mean, Pima County shares that long stretch of border, kind of in that southwest corner, not quite to the west, obviously that's Yuma, but you guys have a large border. How much of this ends up in Tucson?
A lot, but mostly transitory traffic as they come through the border and they end up in Pima County because we're one of the largest population centers that close to the border.
Right.
So we have this transient traffic that lands at least temporarily in the Pima County, Tucson area, and then goes all over the country from there.
This is some video from Customs and Border Protection. This is not unusual. I mean, I've been up in the Black Hawk at night, infrared, and looking at groups on the ground. Back then it was Mexican nationals, but...
I actually know exactly where that fence is.
Tell me.
That's just outside of Sassabee, where the fence ends, and they're just walking around the fence.
Is that a vehicle barrier up to that point?
No, there's actually pedestrian fencing that you're looking at straight ahead there. But as you go off to the right of that picture, that's mountainous area, and the fence ends there, and they simply walk around the fence.
Does any of this make sense to you?
Some of it does. I understand why somebody that woke up this morning in El Salvador might want to come to this country for a better life. That part does make sense to me. But we need a broad, comprehensive immigration policy in the United States, which neither political party seems to be willing to reckon with, and then really comprehensive and sensible border security policy. We have to secure our international border. It is absolutely fundamentally necessary for public safety, national security, and human rights reasons. And I don't understand why 30 years that I've been in law enforcement in Tucson and Pima County, we're still debating this. My fear, John, is that 30 years from now, you'll be sitting across from a sheriff saying, we really ought to do something about this. Well, that's not acceptable.
Well, I think we're almost there, Sheriff, because we've been talking about this that long, and nothing seems to get done. I'm starting to believe now, instead of, as you mentioned, comprehensive, that maybe we've got to do this in pieces, that there's no way to get a consensus on a comprehensive bill. Maybe we take it piece by piece. Maybe we take HB 1B visas. Maybe we take asylum laws on a separate piece. Maybe we take border security on a separate piece. Is that maybe the way to go?
Well, I think requisite to any of that would be first securing our international border.
That's job one.
That's job one. We first have to secure the border and stabilize the situation, and then through political means, address the immigration issue. We have 11, 14 million, pick a number, of people in this country without proper documentation. At some point, we're going to have to reckon with that. We're going to have to reckon with how you get to this country legally. If you do want to come here for a better life, is there a mechanism by which we can do that legally that makes more sense, that's more expeditious, and doesn't encourage illegal migration into this country?
Okay, when the president says this is a crisis, for months we were hearing from opponents, this isn't a crisis, it's a manufactured crisis. You're there, you're down on the border. Is this a crisis?
This is absolutely a crisis. Anybody who argues otherwise is being intellectually dishonest. Anybody who argues otherwise in the face of all of this evidence, which is clear and objective, is being intellectually dishonest with malice. There is clearly a public safety, humanitarian, and national security crisis on our southern border. Now, it has been there in various forms for 30 years, but it is nonetheless a crisis, and it's very aggravated currently.
Do you believe that right now, with what's happening in Central America, our asylum laws are being used against us? We're being jobbed here.
I think they're being leveraged to people that want to come into this country without proper documentation, are leveraging these very loose asylum laws to get into this country, obtain an asylum hearing, and we know that a good majority, a significant majority of these people will never come back for their asylum hearings. We know they're coming transit through Tucson to points all over this country, and the reasonable supposition is they don't intend to come back for their asylum hearing.
What is your definition of a sanctuary city?
It's one where you basically turn a blind eye to the law, and I think that's a dangerous precedent, John, to ask law enforcement to look the other way on a law, any law. There are three branches of government: a branch that enforces laws, a branch that interprets laws, and a branch that makes laws. We shouldn't convolute that. We shouldn't ask people on the executive side, where I reside, to ignore laws. That's not our role. If the laws should be changed, there is a process by which to do that. I think asking law enforcement people to ignore the law is a dangerous precedent.
You know, I talked to former Chief Garcia, Phoenix PD, and he said, you know, the verbiage may be different, but he said, in essence, Phoenix is a sanctuary city. Tucson's a sanctuary city. Because he said, normally what's happening is nobody's asking the question, what's your deal? Why are you here? What are you doing? Nobody's doing that. It ends up getting sorted out in the jail, in your jail, for instance. That's where the final kind of line of defense is, right? When somebody is stopped. Officers won't do it in the field.
Well, I think there's a line, John, between what's my role as a sheriff and my deputies and what is a federal immigration role. I don't expect the Border Patrol to be stopping people for speeding any more than they should expect that I would be proactively engaging in immigration enforcement. First of all, my deputies don't have that authority. We're not a 287G department. Right. So I think you have to stay in your respective lanes for public safety, and you can do that while still maintaining your responsibility to follow the law. I don't think the two are in opposition to each other. I don't think that at all. Okay,
you know, you remember former President Obama. He declared this same humanitarian crisis on the border in mid-2014 after tens of thousands of unaccompanied children began arriving from Central America. Far less than what we're seeing right now. So a Democratic president called it the same thing, a crisis. Why is it, and you've been to the White House, we've got a picture of you, you were there recently. Why is it when President Trump says it, all hell breaks loose?
Politics. Politics is the root of all the problem.
There you are on the end in the front row, right?
Yeah, been to the White House several times, had an occasion to speak to the president, been with him on the border.
Does Paul Penzone, our sheriff here in Maricopa County, does he attend these?
I have not seen Sheriff Penzone at events like this.
Any thoughts as to why?
He'd be better able to speak to that than I would be.
That's a diplomatic way out, Sheriff. I appreciate it. Is it political? Is it that Democrats don't want to be seen with the president under any circumstances, even if we're talking about enforcing law?
Well, remember, John, I come from a very heavily Democrat county.
Oh, yeah.
And
right.
I take a beating if I go talk to the president. But I should not in my county, because if Hillary Clinton were the president, I would still go to the White House, because it's my chance to be heard on issues that affect the people and public safety in my county. I would be remiss if I did not take the chance to have an audience with senior political leaders.
Let me throw up that picture one more time. I just want to get your take on this president. Do you believe his basic instinct about the need to fix this problem is correct?
I most certainly think that we need to fix this problem. There is no doubt about that. We've needed to fix it for 30 years. And
Are his prescriptions the right ones, do you believe?
I think some of the prescriptions are right. I think some of the delivery might be better polished.
Give me some examples.
Well, we seem to have a very fragmented approach, and I'm concerned with public policy by tweets. These are very comprehensive issues.
I think there's a lot of folks who feel that way.
And that concerns me. I was going to be a history teacher where I'm not a police officer. So
Really?
I'm very much a traditionalist when it comes to the role of the president, presidential discourse, how I conduct myself as a matter of the dignity of my office and being an elected official. So I think that we can sit down and have more comprehensive discussions about this as a matter of public policy. I don't like the defeatist thing where the Democrats will always be against us and stuff. If you're the president, you should be able to work through those things. And I think that we can work through those things in a more productive way than sometimes that we do.
When you talk to him, what is he telling you at the White House?
I believe
What is the point of that meeting?
I believe he's absolutely sincere in his desire to approach this problem and to finally fix it. I think he's not harbored by political tradition. In other words, a very non-traditional president. So he approaches these things from a very non-traditional and, if you will, almost an apolitical way. And maybe that will help move the ball forward. But I kind of wish we'd go back a little further.
You think he's not caught in the trappings of kind of what a president, in other words, should or shouldn't do? When he's presented with a problem, you say he looks at it. If somebody says you can't do that, he says, well, why not?
I think there's a lot of that. I think, though, that the pendulum maybe swung a little bit too far, and that he could move himself a little bit back more into that presidential role.
Did you tell him this? Are you in a position where you could say, Mr. President, can I just give you a little advice?
I have said that to people very high up in his administration, that I think we could be better about messaging. We could have a little bit more cohesive public policy than we do.
Can you settle something for me? I mean, Pima County is 36% Hispanic. You're dealing with Latinos all the time. Do you believe this president is xenophobic or racist or any of that stuff that we hear?
I don't see any evidence to that effect at all. I don't see that this is what's driving his political agenda at all. I think that he realizes, and the people around him have told him, that we have a crisis on the border, and that we finally need to have the political resolve to address that, because it is a public safety, national security, and human rights crisis. No reasonable thinking person could deny that.
Do you believe he exploits it for political purposes? Obviously, his base is really inflamed over this issue.
Again, I would have to defer to him. I don't know whether it's exploitation or not, and I'm not interested necessarily in that as so much as I am that we move this ball forward.
But you believe he's sincere, that he sees a problem and he wants to fix it?
Absolutely. I believe he is sincere in the fact that he believes there is a crisis on the border and it's something that we need to address.
Did you get a sense of his level of frustration that it's not being solved? And for instance, he pulled the rug out of his own, from under his own plan this past weekend, when he was going to start deporting people who have been issued deportation orders, people all over the country who have gone through the system, gone through the process, been ordered deported, but they've not left. They're ignoring the order. And he was saying, we're going to go after these folks. But then he bailed on it, and he's taking heat from within his own party over it.
I think there's a lot of frustration in Washington, D.C. that we can't seem to get past the politics of this, because I don't see it as a political issue at all. Public safety is not a political issue. It's not a Republican issue or a Democrat issue, a right or left issue. It's a community issue. It's a quality of life issue. So I see things from a nonpartisan approach with respect to public safety. And I think there's a lot of frustration.
One more before we break, Sheriff. I know that one of the things you inherited was a high murder rate in Pima County. Do you believe any of that is tied to this issue of immigration?
I think some measure of it is. Clearly, domestic violence plays a huge part in the homicide rate in the community, but the influx of drugs, illegal drugs, and the other things that are disquieting to a community with respect to human and drug trafficking will add to the homicide rate in any community.
Sheriff Mark Napier, Pima County, is our guest this week on Newsmaker Saturday. Elected in 2016, and he is now the new vice president of the Major County Sheriffs of America. By the way, the first time that anyone from Pima County has held that position. Back with Sheriff Napier in a moment on Newsmaker Saturday. As we talk about the crisis on the border, and there is some, everybody's reconciled, I think, with that fact that we have what would be labeled by a prudent person, a crisis on our border. Pima County Sheriff Mark Napier is my guest on Newsmaker Saturday, elected In 2016, an Army veteran, 28 years of law enforcement experience, most of it with Tucson Police Department, and he is the new vice president of the Major County Sheriffs of America. You've got 1 million people in your county. How big of an issue is this in Pima County?
Well, it's huge. As we now are releasing asylum seekers into the community, it has really strained our nonprofits and our NGOs, because once Border Patrol elects to provide them an asylum hearing, they're released into the community. Well, we still have a responsibility for adequate care of these people. Otherwise, they'd be engaged in criminality or victims of crime.
Do you see that? I mean, we keep hearing the statistics are that people who come here illegally are less likely to commit a crime than an American citizen. Do you believe that? Do you buy that?
I do. The empirical evidence does suggest that people, if you look at the broad group of people that come here without proper documentation, all studies that I think are academically credible say they're probably no more likely to commit crime than people here legally. That doesn't
most
mean
will want to stay out of law enforcement's net at any
Right.
cost, right? They don't want to attract attention.
Well, that's not to suggest that human and drug traffickers that come to this country without proper documentation do have a high propensity for a violation of crime and so forth. But the average person coming here, quote, for a better life, is no more likely to commit crime than anyone else.
Okay, do you believe, Sheriff, that walls, fences, barriers work?
Yes, they will always be part, and both parties have realized that, John, over the decades, that physical barriers will always be part of a broader look at physical security on our border.
Take a look at that video. Now, that's a pretty fortified area, and as you know, you go to the major cities, and it looks like that.
Mm-hmm.
Take Nogales, for instance, but you start moving out further out, it's stair steps down.
To the point where there's nothing.
There's 3 strands of barbed wire or nothing at all.
Or nothing.
So how do you fortify that border or prevent people from crossing it?
You're always going to have a multifaceted approach, because the border's not one thing, John. It's almost 2,000 linear miles. So the border, even in Pima County, is different than Yuma County, is different from Cochise County, that's different from Santa Cruz. In our own state, that's about 370 miles. So we'll always have physical barriers. That will always be part of a broader immigration, border security approach, but you're going to have to buttress that with technology and human resources.
So the barriers, as I understand it, from the Customs and Border Protection folks, and when I've been down there, they said, look, it's not going to stop. People are still going to try to climb it, but it buys us time to respond. It pinches them into areas that we can respond to, and then it's not just a complete free-for-all. They say it works. They say these fences, barriers are important. You concur?
100%, but you always have to buttress them with human resources and technology, because there will not be a one-size-fits-all approach to our border security.
In 2017, 128 sets of human remains recovered in Pima, Santa Cruz, and Cochise counties, according to your medical examiner in Pima County. People are dying making this journey.
How can you deny that that's not a human rights crisis? How can any thinking person not look at that? Because these are not human remains. They're somebody's brother, somebody's friend, somebody's cousin, somebody's father. So there's a humanitarian crisis, because the coyotes and human traffickers abandon these people short distances into our country with no water or ability to care for themselves.
I've had people ask me, how can someone in an impoverished country who is down and out afford to spend maybe $2,000 or $3,000 to be smuggled here, maybe more? Is it because they're indebted to the smugglers and the drug dealers who bring them here?
Yes, they are. The financial exploitation of undocumented migrants is also significant.
So they're not paying
Sexual
up front,
exploitation.
they're paying on the back end.
Sometimes both ways.
That means criminality is interwoven in this entire situation.
Absolutely. Human trafficking is a multi-million-dollar industry south of the border, and is also feeding the cartels who control the avenues of access into this country.
You've seen the pictures from Maricopa County here in Phoenix, where people are dropped off at the Greyhound bus station. You've seen that video. Is that same thing happening in Tucson?
Absolutely.
And are they going out, the majority of them, to points beyond, into the interior of the United States to vanish? Or do many stay in Tucson?
Very few are actually staying in Tucson. We know that the primary destination for a lot of these people is Florida and the East Coast.
Florida. Interesting. Okay, President Trump calling off these mass deportations. How much angst was there in Pima County when the president was talking about rounding up people who had been ordered deported? Again, in tweets, you illustrated this earlier. People weren't sure who he was going to deport. So through the entire immigrant community, people here illegally, were freaking out. This is for people who've gone through the system and were ordered deported and have ignored that. How much of a ripple was going on in Tucson and Pima County when that happened?
Well, I think a lot of the community was concerned because, again, there wasn't well-defined public policy. We didn't really define who we were going to deport or how we were going to pursue them or the mechanisms by which they'd be deported.
Were you going to help them if they asked you for your help?
Well, that's a federal responsibility, not a local law enforcement responsibility. So that would be, because we don't have the authority.
You wouldn't have been involved in that even in an ancillary way?
Probably not.
Okay. We've got about 4 minutes, Sheriff. Can we get into some solutions? You've been around this a long time with Tucson Police Department, now as a sheriff of Pima County. What do you think are, let's tick off some of the things that could be done to end this?
Secure the border right now. Quit arguing about the semantics of what constitutes a wall, a fence, a barrier. These are very unproductive discussions. Let's secure the border. We have the technology. We know how to build the barriers. We can equip human resources and move them closer to the border, but let's secure the border and let's do it right now because it is an undeniable public safety, national security, and human rights crisis.
What do you do with the Dreamers? The kids who were brought here before they ever even knew why they were coming here or what was going on?
That's a political discussion, and then that should be happening in Washington, D.C., that we should put people in Washington, D.C. who have the political resolve to confront these difficult issues, not continually kick the can down the road, or for political expediency, simply ignore the problem.
Do you think there might be a deal out there where you trade DACA for some more border security? I mean, you hate to get into horse trading on people, but this may be where we're at.
I think politics has always been, to some measure, about some horse trading, about giving up a little bit, getting a little bit, and moving the ball forward in a larger sense.
What do you do about the people who entered the U.S., 45 million, by air, sea, tourist, or business visas that expired in 2015? They believe 416,000 are still living in the country, maybe more. What do you do about that? People who enter just as we do when we travel around abroad, but you just stay, you don't go home. How do you stop that?
Well, you're going to have, again, political solutions to this that are kind of come out of Washington, D.C. We need comprehensive immigration reform, and everybody's known that we needed that for 30 years that I've been around. But we, again, lack the political resolve to do anything about this. We're sending the wrong people to Washington, D.C., in my opinion. They get to Washington, D.C., and they kind of want to live under the radar and not confront very difficult issues at the fear of being unelected. And then they stay there forever. So we tend to elect the wrong people, and then they stay there for all eternity. And I think that we really need to.
You speak for a lot of people.
Well,
when
you know,
but
we kid around and we laugh about it, John, but whose fault is it? It's ours. We keep sending the same people to Washington, D.C. and complaining about the job they do. We don't unelect them. I hope that if the people of my county are not pleased with what I'm doing, I hope they unelect me.
Okay, since it is 35% Hispanic in Pima County, how do Hispanic folks view you going to the White House, your tenure? You're pretty tough on the border and on immigration. How is that received?
I think I try to be very reasonable in my approach to this, and I am a firm supporter of border security, but I don't think that the Hispanic community as a whole is against that. I think that's a fallacy. I really do. I think the Hispanic community wants the same things that all of us want. They want public safety, they want security, they want a broader approach to this problem. So I don't think that things are opposed to the way I approach this and the way my community does.
Do you think, last 20 seconds here, do you think we are in a window of opportunity where something could actually happen?
I hope so. I don't want a sheriff to sit across from you 30 years from now and have the same discussion.
Sheriff Mark Napier, appreciate it. Great to see you. Thank you for your service, and I appreciate what you do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff. We're back in a moment on Newsmaker Saturday. Appreciate it.